Hey guys, tonight we're stepping back in time, not to the grand ballrooms or the bustling factories, but into the hidden corners, the murky depths where the vast majority of Victorian London truly lived. Imagine for a moment the air thick with the stench of coal smoke, unwashed bodies, and something far more putrid, something that clings to your clothes, seeps into your skin, and never quite leaves. You hear the cacophony of 1,000 lives crammed into impossible spaces, the cries of street vendors, the distant clang of a factory bell, the cough of a child, the constant murmur of desperation. This isn't a romanticized vision. This is the raw, unfiltered reality. And honestly, if you were dropped into a Victorian slum, you probably wouldn't last a week. Your modern sensibilities, your immune system, even your concept of personal space, they'd all be utterly overwhelmed. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And as we settle in, let me know where you're tuning in from tonight, and what time it is for you. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. The sense of community, while often strained by hardship, could also be a source of strength against crime. Neighbors would look out for each other, sharing information about potential threats, or offering shelter to those in danger. This informal network of support was often the only protection available in a world where official assistance was scarce. It was a form of self-preservation, a collective effort to survive the dangers of the streets. You find yourself standing on a cobbled street, slick with a perpetual film of grime, the kind that sticks to your boots and makes every step feel a little precarious. The fog, a familiar companion in these parts, hangs heavy, a thick, sooty blanket that swallows the weak gaslight and muffles the sounds, making the world feel even more claustrophobic. It's a chill that isn't just from the air, it's a damp, pervasive cold that seems to seep into your very bones. A cold that promises nothing but misery. Look around you. The buildings loom, dark and skeletal, their windows staring out like vacant eyes. These aren't the grand, imposing structures you might picture when you think of Victorian London. These are warrens of crumbling brick, hastily constructed and endlessly subdivided. The Victorian slum was a harsh teacher, forcing its inhabitants to develop a keen sense of awareness, a quick wit, and a hardened exterior. You learn to read people, to spot danger, to trust few, and to rely on your own instincts. It was a brutal education, but one that was essential for survival in a world where the shadows of crime and despair were always lurking, just around the next grimy corner. You crane your neck, trying to see the sky, but it's an impossible task. The alleyways are so narrow, the buildings so tall and close, that only a sliver of gray, bruised light manages to pierce the perpetual gloom. It feels like the world has closed in, trapping you in this maze of despair. The air itself tastes metallic, a mix of damp earth, industrial soot, and something else. Something fetid and sickly sweet. You might wrinkle your nose, instinctively recoiling, but there's no escape. This is the air you breathe here, every single second. It's a stark reminder that even the simple act of inhaling is a compromise. You've navigated the treacherous streets, glimpsed the grim interiors, confronted the pervasive sickness, endured the relentless toil, and faced the gnawing hunger and the shadows of crime. Now, let's turn our gaze to the most heartbreaking aspect of the Victorian slum, the childhood lost in grime. In this world, innocence was a fleeting luxury, and the tender years of youth were often brutally cut short by hardship, labor, and disease. As you tentatively step forward, the sounds become clearer. The rhythmic creak of a handcart laden with who knows what, the distant, mournful wail of a foghorn from the Thames, and closer, the incessant drone of flies. Oh, the flies. They are everywhere, but buzzing around unseen refuse, landing on every surface, a constant irritating presence that speaks volumes about the sanitation, or rather, the complete lack thereof. You instinctively swat at one that lands on your cheek. A futile gesture in this insect-ridden landscape. Imagine yourself as a child here. Not the carefree and playful child you might envision, but a small, often malnourished figure, dressed in clothes that are too large or too small, patched and repatched until their original fabric is barely discernible. Your face is perpetually smudged with dirt, your hands ingrained with grime, and your eyes, though young, hold a startling maturity, a weary knowledge of the world that no child should possess. You learn quickly, not from books, but from the harsh lessons of survival. The overwhelming impression is one of overwhelming human density. Every doorway seems to disgorge a stream of people, their faces etched with the harsh realities of their lives. Children, many no older than 5 or 6, scurry about, their clothes ragged and their faces smudged with dirt. They play games with sticks and stones, their laughter a thin, reedy sound that quickly gets swallowed by the surrounding cacophony. You notice their eyes, sharp, watchful, already accustomed to the struggle. They are survivors, born into a world that offers little quarter. The common historical fact is that child labor was incredibly widespread, and often began at an astonishingly young age. Children as young as 5 or 6 were routinely employed in factories, mines, and as domestic servants, or engaged in various street trades. Their small stature and nimble fingers made them ideal for tasks that adults couldn't perform, such as crawling into narrow mine shafts or reaching under machinery to retrieve fallen bobbins in textile mills. You might be one of these children spending your days in deafening noise and choking dust, your small body aching with exhaustion. You pass by a common lodging house, its door ajar, revealing a glimpse of the interior. The air that spills out is thick with the smell of unwashed bodies, stale tobacco, and something indefinable, but certainly unpleasant. You hear the murmurs of voices, the occasional cough, the rustle of straw. Imagine trying to sleep in such a place, crammed in with strangers, the sounds and smells of their lives pressing in on you from every side. It's a constant invasion of your personal space, a complete dissolution of privacy. This isn't just about sharing a room, it's about sharing every breath, every cough, every restless shift in the night. The concept of individual comfort, or even basic dignity, seems like a forgotten luxury here. Your education often consisted of learning how to survive on the streets. You'd quickly master the art of dodging traffic, identifying potential customers if you were a vendor, or knowing which alleyways offered a quick escape from trouble. Playtime was a rare luxury, snatched in brief moments between chores or work. Games were simple, often involving sticks, stones, or discarded objects, played in the grimy streets or narrow courtyards. Laughter, when it came, was often a sharp, brief burst, quickly swallowed by the surrounding cacophony of the slum. Further down the street, a woman is trying to sell some bruised apples from a rickety cart. Her hands are chapped and red, her face lined beyond her years. She calls out, her voice hoarse, but few passers-by seem to have the pennies to spare. You watch as a child, perhaps her own, pulls at her tattered skirt, a silent plea in their eyes. The desperation is palpable, a tangible weight in the air. This isn't just poverty, it's destitution, a daily struggle for the barest necessities. The concept of a protected childhood, a time for learning and play, was almost entirely absent for the majority of children in these districts. From the moment they could walk, they were expected to contribute to the family income. Every penny they earned, however meager, was crucial for the family's survival. This meant sacrificing school, sacrificing rest, and sacrificing the very essence of what we consider a normal childhood. You were not just a child, you were a miniature adult, burdened with adult responsibilities. Think for a moment about the concept of home. For many, it's a sanctuary, a place of safety and warmth. But here, the home is often just another battleground. A single room, perhaps barely larger than your modern-day bathroom, might house an entire family, parents, children, perhaps even an elderly relative. There's no running water, no indoor plumbing. A single tap in the yard might serve dozens of families. A constant queue forming, a site of daily communal friction. The privy, often overflowing and shared by multiple households, is a breeding ground for disease. The historian Judith Flanders, in her comprehensive work on Victorian domestic life, meticulously details the challenges of maintaining even a semblance of cleanliness in such conditions. She notes that for many, the effort was simply overwhelming, a losing battle against the sheer volume of dirt and disease. For those who worked in factories, the dangers were immense. Long hours, often 12 to 14 hours a day, were spent in dangerous conditions. Children working in textile mills risked losing fingers or limbs to unguarded machinery. Those in coal mines faced the constant threat of cave-ins, explosions, and the slow, insidious onset of lung disease. Chimney sweeps, often young boys, faced suffocation and severe burns as they squeezed through narrow flues. Imagine the terror of being trapped in a dark, confined space, your lungs burning with soot, knowing that one wrong move could be your last. It's a job that would give you nightmares for a lifetime, if you even lived long enough to have them. You might wonder how anyone could possibly survive in such conditions, let alone thrive. The answer often is they didn't. Life expectancy in these areas was appallingly low, childhood was fleeting, and old age a rare privilege. Diseases that are now easily treatable, like tuberculosis or cholera, swept through these overcrowded districts with devastating speed, carrying off thousands. It was a constant game of chance, a roll of the dice with fate, where the odds were overwhelmingly stacked against you. You recall a peculiar and morbid detail from this era, the widespread belief, even among some medical professionals, that diseases like cholera were caused by miasma, bad air, rather than contaminated water. This persistent misunderstanding meant that even well-intentioned public health efforts often missed the mark entirely, leading to tragic, preventable deaths. It's almost comically tragic in hindsight, isn't it? Imagine thinking a bad smell could kill you, while the very water you drink is teeming with death. An obscure detail about child labor in the slums is the existence of crossing sweepers. These were often young boys or girls who would sweep a path through the muddy, horse dung-filled streets for well-dressed pedestrians, hoping for a penny or two in return. It was a physically demanding and often thankless job, exposing them to the elements and the constant risk of being run over by carriages. Imagine spending your day knee-deep in filth, trying to make a clean path for someone who barely glances at you. It's a stark illustration of the desperate measures children took to earn a few coins. The very structure of these slums contributed to their misery. Landlords, often absentee and driven solely by profit, carved up existing houses into as many rentable units as possible. Rooms meant for 1 or 2 people were crammed with 6, 8, even 10. Basements, damp and prone to flooding, were rented out as living spaces. Attics, stifling in summer and freezing in winter, also found occupants. There was no fire safety, no building codes to speak of. A flickering candle, a faulty chimney, and an entire tenement could go up in flames in minutes, trapping its helpless inhabitants. You can almost hear the crackle and roar, can't you? The frantic screams, the desperate scramble for survival as the flames consume everything. It's a stark contrast to our modern understanding of building regulations and safety standards. For girls, a domestic service was a common path, often beginning as young as 8 or 10. They would leave their families to work long hours in the homes of the wealthy, performing arduous tasks like scrubbing floors, carrying coal, and tending to fires. They were often isolated, lonely, and vulnerable to exploitation. Their days were filled with endless chores, their nights spent in a small, cold attic room, far from the warmth of their own families. You'd miss your siblings, your mother's voice, the familiar smells of your cramped home, however unpleasant they were. And yet, amidst this squalor, life continued. People fell in love, had families, celebrated small victories, mourned great losses. There was a fierce sense of community, born out of shared hardship. Neighbors helped neighbors, forming a support network in a world that offered little official assistance. Historians still debate whether this communal spirit was a genuine source of strength and resilience, or simply a desperate coping mechanism in the face of overwhelming adversity. Was it true camaraderie, or just a shared misery that bound them together? The truth, perhaps, lies somewhere in between. It was a brutal existence, but one not entirely devoid of human connection. The laughter, when it came, felt earned, perhaps even more precious because of its rarity. The health of these children was perpetually precarious. Malnutrition, as we've discussed, led to widespread rickets, stunted growth, and weakened immune systems. Diseases like measles, scarlet fever, and diphtheria swept through the overcrowded tenements, often carrying off the youngest and weakest. A child's cough could quickly escalate into a life-threatening illness, and parents could only watch helplessly, often without access to doctors or medicine. The mortality rate for children was appallingly high. Many did not live to see their 5th birthday. It was a constant cycle of grief for parents, a brutal reminder of the fragility of life. As you walk on, the sounds change again. From an open window, you hear the distant, tinny plink of a piano and a woman's voice, singing a melancholic tune. It's a music hall song. Perhaps a brief escape from the grim reality outside. It reminds you that even here, people sought solace, a moment of forgetfulness. They found it in the pub, in illicit gambling dens, in the arms of a lover, or simply in the shared warmth of a small, crowded room. The human spirit, it seems, is remarkably resilient, capable of finding pinpricks of light even in the deepest darkness. You might reflect on how your own comforts, your Netflix, your phone, your warm bed, are designed to provide a similar kind of escape, just with far fewer immediate threats. It makes you wonder, doesn't it, what our own slums of discomfort and stress might look like to future generations. Historians still debate whether the child labor laws that were gradually introduced in the Victorian era were primarily driven by humanitarian concerns, or by economic factors such as the desire to protect adult jobs and ensure a more educated future workforce. Was it genuine compassion or pragmatic self-interest? The truth is likely a complex mix, reflecting the evolving social conscience of the time. You've had a glimpse of the streets, the pervasive grime, the sheer density of life. Now let's peel back the layers of those crumbling brick walls and step inside, into what passed for home in a Victorian slum. The very word home feels like a cruel joke here, a distant echo of comfort and sanctuary. What you encounter is a stark, brutal reality that challenges every modern notion of personal space, hygiene, and even basic human dignity. Education, for many, was a luxury. While ragged schools and Sunday schools offered some basic literacy and religious instruction, attendance was often sporadic, dictated by the demands of work or the need to care for younger siblings. The idea of universal, compulsory education was still a distant dream. Most children learned what they needed to survive on the streets or in the workplace, acquiring practical skills rather than academic knowledge. You might learn to count money, to haggle, or to mend a torn garment, but not to read a book. As you push open a creaking, splintered door, if there even is a door, and not just a tattered curtain, the first thing that assaults your senses is the smell. It's a thick, cloying mixture of dampness, stale cooking fumes, unwashed bodies, and the ever-present, acrid tang of human waste from the overflowing privies outside. It's a smell that permeates everything, clinging to the threadbare fabrics, seeping into the very plaster of the walls. You might instinctively hold your breath, but it's a futile gesture. This is the air you will breathe, day in and day out. It's the scent of poverty made tangible, a constant reminder of your surroundings. The streets were both a playground and a classroom. Children learned to navigate the complex social hierarchies of the slum, to identify potential threats, and to find opportunities for earning a few pennies. They formed their own gangs and social groups, finding camaraderie and a sense of belonging in a world that often felt indifferent to their existence. This street wisdom, while essential for survival, often came at the cost of formal education and a protected childhood. The room itself is shockingly small, perhaps 10 feet by 12, if you're lucky. And in this meager space, an entire family, sometimes two, makes their life. Imagine a single room serving as kitchen, bedroom, living area, and often workshop. There's no separate kitchen, no cozy sitting room, no private bedroom. Every activity, every moment of life unfolds within these four cramped walls. You see a lumpy, straw-filled mattress, perhaps two, crammed into a corner, serving as the communal bed for parents and several children. Privacy is a luxury utterly unknown here. The concept of a quiet moment to yourself, a space to simply be, is alien. Even the simple act of play was different. There were no organized sports teams, no playgrounds with swings and slides. Children invented their own games, using whatever was at hand: skipping ropes made of old rags, marbles fashioned from clay, or simple games of chase through the narrow alleyways. Their play was often rough, reflecting the harshness of their environment, but it was also a vital outlet for their boundless energy and creativity. You'd find joy in the smallest things: a discarded toy, a moment of laughter with a friend. The light, what little there is, struggles to penetrate the grimy window, often patched with paper or rags where glass has long since shattered. Even in the middle of the day, the room is perpetually dim, a perpetual twilight that only deepens the sense of oppression. At night, the only illumination comes from a single flickering candle or a sputtering oil lamp, casting dancing shadows that make the already cramped space feel even more claustrophobic. The air, already heavy with smells, becomes thick with the smoke and soot from these rudimentary light sources, further irritating your lungs. The psychological toll on these children was immense. They witnessed poverty, illness, death, and violence on a daily basis. They carried the burden of adult responsibilities from a young age. This exposure to hardship often led to a premature loss of innocence, a hardening of their spirits. Yet, paradoxically, many retained a remarkable resilience, a stubborn capacity for hope and joy even in the most dire circumstances. They found strength in their families, in their communities, and in their own unbreakable spirits. Look closely at the walls. They are peeling, damp, and often stained with mildew. Patches of plaster have fallen away, exposing the raw brick beneath. In some places, you might spot dark, telltale streaks where water has seeped in, a constant battle against the elements. The roof, if you dare to look up, might show signs of leaks, with buckets or pots strategically placed to catch the drips. The landlord, if they even bother to collect rent in person, certainly isn't investing in repairs. But why would they, when there's always another desperate family waiting to take your place? The sheer number of children in these families was also a significant factor. With high infant mortality rates, parents often had many children in the hope that some would survive to adulthood and contribute to the family income. This meant more mouths to feed in already overcrowded homes, further exacerbating the cycle of poverty. You might be one of many siblings, all vying for limited resources, all sharing the same cramped space. The furniture is sparse and rudimentary, a rickety table, perhaps a few stools or an upturned crate. Every item serves multiple purposes. The table might be where meals are eaten, where clothes are mended, where children do their lessons if they are fortunate enough to attend school, and where a parent might work late into the night, stitching garments or assembling small trinkets for a meager wage. There are no decorative flourishes, no personal touches beyond the bare necessities. Every inch of space is utilized. Every object has a function, often several. The plight of orphaned or abandoned children was particularly grim. Without family support, they were often forced to fend for themselves on the streets, resorting to begging, petty theft, or worse, just to survive. Charitable organizations and workhouses offered some refuge, but conditions were often harsh, and the stigma of being an orphan was profound. These children were truly alone in a brutal world, their vulnerability heartbreaking. One of the most striking aspects of these homes is the sheer lack of sanitation. There is no running water inside. For water, you must fetch it from a communal pump or standpipe in the yard or street, often shared by dozens of other families. Imagine queuing for water, carrying heavy buckets back to your tiny room, knowing that every drop is precious and must be conserved. This water, often drawn from contaminated sources, is used for drinking, cooking, and washing. The concept of a daily bath is unthinkable. Personal hygiene is a constant struggle, limited by the availability of water and the sheer effort required. One particularly poignant aspect was the early exposure to death. Children would witness the deaths of siblings, parents, and neighbors from disease or accidents. Funerals were common occurrences, and death was an ever-present reality. This early exposure to mortality shaped their understanding of life, making them acutely aware of its fragility and brevity. You'd learn to accept death as a part of life, a grim inevitability in your world, and then there are the privies. These are communal, often overflowing cesspits located in the yard or alleyway. They are rarely cleaned, breeding grounds for disease, and their stench permeates the entire neighborhood. You can almost feel the flies swarming around them, carrying disease from one household to another. It's a common historical fact that the lack of proper sewage systems and clean water was the primary driver of epidemics like cholera, which ravaged these slum communities. The connection between filth and disease, while understood by some medical reformers, was still largely ignored or misunderstood by the general populace and authorities. It makes you wonder how many times you'd hold your breath just to walk past one of these things. It's like a permanent, invisible cloud of nope hanging over the entire area. The efforts to improve the lives of these children were slow and incremental. Reformers, philanthropists, and social workers began to highlight the appalling conditions of child labor and the need for education. Figures like Dr. Thomas Barnardo, a common historical fact, established homes for destitute children, offering them shelter, food, and education. These efforts, while significant, were often a drop in the ocean compared to the vast scale of the problem. The sheer number of people crammed into these small spaces meant that disease spread like wildfire. A cough from one person quickly became a cough from everyone. Measles, scarlet fever, diphtheria, and tuberculosis were rampant. If one child fell ill, it was almost guaranteed that the others would follow. The air was thick with airborne pathogens, and the close contact ensured rapid transmission. You are living in a giant petri dish, essentially, and the bacteria are having a grand old time. The children of the slums were often remarkably resourceful. They learned to make do with very little, to improvise, and to find opportunities where none seemed to exist. They developed a street smarts that allowed them to navigate a dangerous world, to spot a scam, or to find a way to earn a few pennies. This ingenuity was born out of necessity, a testament to their innate drive to survive. Historians still debate whether the urban poor of this era developed a stronger natural immunity to some diseases due to constant exposure from birth, or if the sheer density and poor sanitation simply overwhelmed any such adaptations. It's a grim thought. Isn't it that your body might be fighting a constant, unseen war just to keep you alive? The sheer physical appearance of these children was often striking. Their small frames, pale faces, and often ragged clothing spoke volumes about their impoverished existence. Their laughter, when it came, could be a startling contrast to their appearance. A flash of pure, unadulterated joy amidst the grim reality. You'd see the resilience in their eyes, a spark that refused to be extinguished despite everything. The concept of lodgers was also incredibly common. To make ends meet, families would often take in additional boarders, further exacerbating the overcrowding. A single room might house a family of 5, plus 2 or 3 single men or women, all sharing the same space, the same air, the same meager resources. This was a desperate measure, born out of economic necessity, but it came at a huge cost to comfort, privacy, and even safety. Imagine sharing your tiny living space with strangers, their habits and quirks becoming an unavoidable part of your daily life. It's like a permanent, uninvited slumber party, except no one brought snacks. The legacy of these lost childhoods is a powerful reminder of the importance of social welfare, public health, and universal education. It underscores the profound impact that poverty and inequality can have on the most vulnerable members of society. The struggles of these Victorian children laid the groundwork for the child protection laws and educational opportunities that we often take for granted today. Their brief, harsh lives echo through history, a quiet plea for a better world. One obscure detail about these living conditions is the widespread use of rag picking or bone picking as a source of income. Families, including young children, would spend their days sifting through refuse, looking for anything that could be sold. Old rags, bones, bits of metal, even dog excrement, which was used in tanneries. These items would then be brought back to the cramped living quarters, further adding to the squalor and the pervasive stench. Your home wasn't just where you lived, it was where you processed the literal garbage of the city. It's a stark illustration of the desperate measures people took to survive, turning the very waste of society into a means of sustenance. You've witnessed the brutal realities of the Victorian slum. From the suffocating streets to the lost childhoods, it's a landscape of relentless hardship, where every day is a battle for survival. Yet, even in the deepest shadows, the human spirit finds ways to flicker, to seek out moments of respite, however fleeting. Tonight, let's explore those rare, precious instances of joy, of escape, that punctuated the otherwise grim existence in the slum. The furniture, if it could even be called that, was often salvaged or homemade. A wooden crate might serve as a chair, a stack of old newspapers as a pillow. There was no concept of interior design or comfort as we understand it today. Everything was functional, utilitarian, and often on the verge of collapse. The very act of sitting down might involve a careful assessment of the structural integrity of your makeshift seat. You'd probably develop a sixth sense for creaking wood and loose nails, Imagine the end of a long, grueling workday. Your body aches, your mind is numb with exhaustion, and the familiar pangs of hunger are a constant companion. But tonight, perhaps, you have a few extra pennies, or a friend has offered to treat you. Your destination, the local public house, or pub. As you approach, the sounds grow louder, the murmur of voices, the clinking of glasses, the occasional burst of raucous laughter. The warm, inviting glow of the gaslight spills out onto the grimy street, a beacon in the pervasive gloom. Even the simple act of cooking was a challenge. A single, small fireplace, if available, would be used for heating and cooking. Fuel, usually coal, was expensive, so fires were kept small and often allowed to die down to conserve resources. Meals were simple, often just gruel or bread, cooked over an open flame in a single pot. The smoke from the fire, combined with the dampness, would further blacken the walls and ceiling, adding another layer of grime to the already oppressive environment. Imagine trying to make a gourmet meal in a space where the smoke detector would be constantly screaming, if such a thing even existed. Stepping inside, you're hit by a wave of warmth, a welcome contrast to the damp cold outside. The air is thick with the smell of stale beer, tobacco smoke, and unwashed bodies. But tonight, it feels comforting, familiar. The pub is crammed, a sea of faces, all seeking the same temporary oblivion. There's a roaring fire in the hearth, casting flickering shadows on the walls, and the sounds of conversation rise to a cheerful roar. This is a common historical fact. Pubs were not just places to drink. They were vital social hubs, community centers where people could escape their cramped homes, share news, find work, and briefly forget their troubles. The constant dampness and lack of ventilation also led to a pervasive problem with vermin. Rats and mice were common inhabitants of these homes, scurrying through the walls and floors, attracted by the refuse and the warmth of human bodies. Fleas and lice were an inescapable part of life, causing constant itching and discomfort. You would be sharing your bed, your food, and your very skin with these unwelcome guests. It's enough to make your skin crawl just thinking about it. Isn't it a constant, unseen battle against tiny, persistent invaders? You push your way to the bar, elbowing gently through the crowd, and order a pint of ale or perhaps a glass of gin. The drink, often watered down and of questionable quality, nevertheless offers a welcome warmth that spreads through your weary body. For a few moments, the hunger pangs dull, the aches subside, and the anxieties of the day recede. It's a brief, blissful escape, a momentary reprieve from the relentless grind. You might even find yourself cracking a smile, something that feels foreign after days of grim determination. The sounds inside these homes were as relentless as the smells. The constant chatter of family members, the cries of infants, the coughs of the sick, the sounds of neighbors through thin walls. There was no escaping the human symphony of the slum. Sleep, when it came, was often fitful and disturbed, punctuated by the sounds of the street, the creaking of the building, and the movements of those sharing your cramped space. It was a world without silence, a constant hum of human existence that could be both comforting and utterly maddening. Conversation flows freely. You might share a joke with a stranger, complain about your landlord, or discuss the latest news from the docks or the factory. There's a camaraderie here, a shared understanding born of common hardship. For a few hours, you're not just a cog in the industrial machine. You're a person, sharing stories and laughter with your fellow travelers through this harsh life. It's like a really bad support group. But with more beer and less therapy, despite the unimaginable hardships, there was a resilience, a stubborn refusal to be completely broken. People found ways to cope, to carve out moments of joy, to maintain a semblance of human connection. They shared stories, sang songs, and found humor in the darkest of situations. This shared experience of adversity often forged incredibly strong bonds within families and among neighbors. It was a testament to the enduring human spirit, a flicker of light in the overwhelming darkness. Beyond the pub, music halls offered a more structured form of entertainment. These were often grander establishments, though still accessible to the working class, where you could enjoy live performances, singers, comedians, dancers, and acrobats. The atmosphere was boisterous and lively, with audiences singing along, shouting encouragement, and throwing pennies onto the stage for their favorite performers. This was a chance to see something truly spectacular, to be transported, however briefly, from the mundane realities of your life. You've navigated the grimy streets and peeked into the cramped, airless homes. Now, let's confront the invisible enemy that stalked every corner of the Victorian slum. An adversary far more relentless and pervasive than any human foe disease. In this world, sickness wasn't an occasional inconvenience. It was a constant, looming threat. An inescapable part of daily life that dictated everything from your energy levels to your very survival. Imagine the thrill of seeing a brightly lit stage. The performers in their dazzling, if somewhat worn costumes. Their voices filling the hall. For a few hours, you could forget the dirt, the hunger, the constant struggle. You could laugh, you could cheer, you could lose yourself in the spectacle. It was a powerful form of escapism, a vital release for spirits constantly under siege. You'd probably leave feeling a little lighter, a little more hopeful, even if the feeling quickly faded once you stepped back onto the dark streets. Imagine waking up each morning, not with the anticipation of a new day, but with a quiet dread, wondering if today would be the day the cough turned into something worse, or if the fever that had been lurking in the background would finally take hold. The air itself feels heavy with pathogens, a silent, invisible cloud that you breathe with every inhale. You're not just living in a slum, you're living in a giant, unsterilized laboratory where bacteria and viruses thrive. An obscure detail about music halls is the popularity of topical songs, tunes that commented on current events, social issues, or even local scandals. These songs often contained thinly veiled criticisms of authority or humorous observations about daily life, allowing audiences to collectively vent their frustrations and find solidarity in shared experiences. Imagine a comedian today making fun of your boss, but in a song, and everyone in the room knows exactly what they're talking about. It was a subtle form of social commentary and wrapped in entertainment. The most common historical fact about disease in Victorian slums is the devastating impact of cholera. This terrifying illness, characterized by severe diarrhea and dehydration, could kill a person within hours. It swept through communities with terrifying speed, leaving behind a trail of death and despair. You've already seen the overflowing privies and the communal water pumps drawing from contaminated sources. This was the perfect storm for cholera to flourish. The water, the very essence of life, became an agent of death. It's a chilling thought, isn't it? That the one thing you desperately needed could be the very thing that ended you. For those with even less to spare, the streets themselves offered a form of entertainment. Street performers, buskers, acrobats, Punch and Judy shows, even fire eaters would gather crowds, hoping for a few tossed coins. You'd stand enthralled, captivated by the magic of a simple trick or the drama of a puppet show. These were fleeting moments of wonder, brief splashes of color in an otherwise gray world, proving that even without money, there was still art. But cholera was just one of many grim reapers. Tuberculosis, often called consumption, was a slow, wasting disease that gnawed away at its victims, leaving them frail and weak. You'd hear the persistent, hacking coughs echoing through the thin walls of your tenement, a constant, mournful soundtrack to life in the slums. It was a disease that preyed on the malnourished and the overcrowded, finding fertile ground in the damp, airless rooms where families huddled together. It wasn't a quick death, but a prolonged, agonizing decline, watching your loved ones slowly fade away. Religious gatherings, particularly those organized by evangelical groups like the Salvation Army, also offered a form of solace and community. While not entertainment in the traditional sense, they provided a sense of belonging, spiritual comfort, and often practical assistance like soup kitchens or temporary shelter. For many, faith was a powerful anchor in a turbulent world, offering hope for a better life, if not in this world, then in the next. You'd find a quiet strength in the hymns, a sense of peace in the shared belief. Then there were the childhood killers' measles, scarlet fever, diphtheria, whooping cough. These illnesses, now largely preventable through vaccination, were rampant and deadly. A child's fever could quickly escalate into a crisis, and parents could only watch helplessly, often without access to doctors or medicine. The mortality rate for children in these areas was shockingly high, a grim testament to the brutal conditions. You'd see families with many children, but few who reached adulthood. It was a constant cycle of birth and death, a heartbreaking reality that hardened even the most resilient souls. Imagine the sheer terror of hearing your child struggle for breath, knowing there's absolutely nothing you can do. It's a kind of helplessness that modern medicine has largely eradicated. Thankfully, historians still debate whether these forms of entertainment and social gathering served primarily as a means of social control, distracting the poor from their grievances, or if they were genuine expressions of working-class culture and resilience. Were they opiates for the masses, or vital outlets for human spirit? The truth, as always, is likely somewhere in the middle, a complex interplay of both. The lack of proper sanitation was, of course, the primary culprit. Imagine a world where human waste mingled with drinking water, where refuse piled high in the streets, attracting rats and flies, and where personal hygiene was a constant losing battle. There were no public health initiatives as we understand them today, no widespread understanding of germ theory. While some reformers, like Edwin Chadwick, began to advocate for improved sanitation, their ideas were often met with resistance or simply overwhelmed by the sheer scale of the problem. It's a common historical fact that Chadwick's report on the sanitary condition of the laboring population was a landmark, but its recommendations took decades to implement fully. Even simple pleasures took on profound significance. A warm loaf of bread, a shared pipe of tobacco, a quiet moment with a loved one. These were not taken for granted. They were cherished, savored, their value amplified by their rarity. You learn to appreciate the small things, to find beauty in the mundane, to extract every drop of joy from the limited resources available to you. It's like finding a perfectly ripe avocado when you've only had instant noodles for a month. Pure bliss. An obscure detail about the fight against disease in Victorian times is the practice of fumigation, using substances like carbolic acid or even burning sulfur. People would try to cleanse their homes of disease by filling them with acrid smoke, believing it would kill the miasma or bad air. While well-intentioned, these methods were often ineffective against microscopic pathogens and sometimes even harmful to the inhabitants. Imagine trying to breathe in a room filled with sulfur smoke, all in the desperate hope of warding off an illness you couldn't even see. It's a bit like trying to fight a dragon with a feather duster. Isn't it a valiant, but ultimately futile, effort? The sheer resilience of the human spirit is truly remarkable. Despite the constant struggle, the pervasive illness, the gnawing hunger, people found ways to laugh, to connect, to celebrate. They held on to their humanity, their capacity for joy, even when the world around them seemed determined to crush it. These moments of fleeting happiness were not just diversions, they were vital acts of defiance, a refusal to be utterly consumed by despair. Access to medical care was virtually non-existent for the vast majority of slum dwellers. Doctors were expensive, and hospitals were often seen as places where you went to die, not to get better. For minor ailments, people relied on home remedies, traditional healers, or the advice of neighbors. For serious illnesses, it was often a matter of enduring the suffering, hoping for the best, and preparing for the worst. The idea of a free, accessible healthcare system was centuries away. You were on your own, battling illness with nothing but your own resilience and perhaps a few dubious folk cures. For children, play, however limited, was a crucial outlet. Even in the grimy streets, they found ways to invent games, to run and shout, to briefly forget the harsh realities of their lives. A discarded hoop and a stick could become a chariot, a pile of rubble a mountain to conquer. Their imaginations, untamed by formal education, were boundless, allowing them to create worlds of their own, however temporary. You'd see the pure, unadulterated joy in their eyes, a stark contrast to the weary faces of the adults, even if you managed to get to a hospital. The conditions there were often little better than the slums themselves. Before the widespread adoption of antiseptic practices, surgical wards could be breeding grounds for infection. A simple cut could turn into a life-threatening ordeal if it became infected. Florence Nightingale's reforms in nursing and hospital hygiene were revolutionary precisely because they addressed this terrifying reality. Her work, a common historical fact, dramatically reduced mortality rates in military hospitals and later influenced civilian ones. The annual fair or market day was another source of excitement. These events brought a carnival atmosphere to the drab streets, with stalls selling trinkets, street performers, and perhaps even a crude carousel. It was a rare opportunity for families to come together, to enjoy a day out, and to experience a sense of festivity. The sights, sounds, and smells of the fair were a sensory overload, a welcome break from the monotony of daily life. You'd save your pennies for weeks, just for a chance to experience this fleeting magic. The sheer physical demands of daily life also contributed to the constant state of ill health. Malnutrition was rampant, weakening immune systems and making people more susceptible to disease. Long hours of back-breaking labor, often in dangerous and unsanitary conditions, further exhausted the body. A simple cold could quickly escalate into pneumonia for someone whose body was already struggling to survive. You were constantly on the edge, your body a fragile vessel against a sea of threats. The camaraderie among neighbors, forged in shared hardship, also provided moments of joy, a helping hand, a shared meal, a comforting word. These small acts of kindness were invaluable. People looked out for each other, forming a tight-knit community that offered support and solidarity. In a world that often felt indifferent, these connections were a vital source of warmth and human connection. It's like a really tough reality show, but everyone actually likes each other. Historians still debate whether the high rates of illness in the slums were primarily due to environmental factors like sanitation and overcrowding, or if genetic predispositions and poor nutrition played an equally significant role. It's a complex interplay. Isn't it a vicious cycle where poverty begot poor health, and poor health perpetuated poverty? There's no simple answer. No single villain to blame. Even the humble street corner could become a stage. Orators, preachers, and political agitators would draw crowds, their impassioned speeches offering hope, defiance, or simply a different perspective on the world. You'd listen, captivated by their words, perhaps finding a flicker of inspiration or a renewed sense of purpose. These were moments of intellectual engagement, a chance to hear new ideas and to feel part of something larger than yourself. Imagine the psychological toll of living under this constant threat. Every sniffle, every ache, every moment of fatigue would be amplified by the knowledge that it could be the beginning of the end. Parents watched their children sicken and die. Siblings lost each other, and the elderly faded away, often alone. Grief was a constant companion, a shadow that stretched over every family. You'd become accustomed to the sight of funeral processions, the quiet solemnity of a coffin being carried through the narrow streets. Death was not a distant concept. It was a familiar neighbor, always lurking. The fleeting joys of the Victorian slum were not grand or extravagant. They were simple, often improvised, and always hard-won. But they were essential. They provided a vital counterpoint to the relentless hardship. A reminder that even in the darkest of times, the human spirit yearns for connection, for laughter, for a moment of peace. They were the pinpricks of light that kept hope alive. However faint, the very concept of cleanliness was a luxury. Without running water, without soap, without proper drainage, how could one hope to stay clean? Clothes were rarely washed, accumulating layers of dirt and grime. Bodies were rarely bathed. This lack of personal hygiene, while understandable given the circumstances, further contributed to the spread of skin infections, lice, and other ailments. You'd be constantly itching, constantly uncomfortable, a living testament to the pervasive filth. It's enough to make you want to take a 5-hour shower just thinking about it. Think about the sheer relief of a moment of laughter, a genuine, belly-aching laugh that momentarily banished all worries. In a world where tears were common, laughter was a precious commodity, a testament to the resilience of the human spirit. It was a release, a catharsis, a reminder that even in the depths of despair, joy could still be found. You'd cling to those moments, replay them in your mind, let them sustain you through the darker times. Even the food, when you could get it, could be a source of illness. Adulteration of food was common, with unscrupulous vendors adding chalk to milk, plaster to flour, or even dangerous chemicals to stretch their products. You might be eating something that looked like food, but was slowly poisoning you. The concept of food safety standards was decades away, and the poor were often the most vulnerable to these deceptive practices. It's a grim thought that even your meager meal could be a betrayal. The sheer ingenuity of people creating entertainment with almost nothing was astounding. A group of friends might gather to sing songs, tell stories, or play simple instruments. Children would invent elaborate games with discarded objects. These were not passive consumers of entertainment. They were active creators, finding ways to amuse themselves and each other, proving that creativity thrives even in the harshest environments. The sheer resilience of the human body, even in these conditions, is a testament to its incredible adaptability. People did survive against all odds. They developed a certain hardiness, a tolerance for discomfort and disease that would shock modern sensibilities. But it came at a cost, a constant drain on their vitality, leaving them aged beyond their years, their bodies ravaged by a lifetime of struggle. You'd see young adults who looked like they were in their 50s, their faces etched with hardship, their bodies stooped and worn. The simple pleasure of a Sunday stroll, if you had the time and energy, was also a cherished moment. To walk beyond the immediate confines of your street, to see a different part of the city, to breathe slightly cleaner air, these were small freedoms that offered a sense of renewal. You might even glimpse the grander parts of London, the elegant squares and bustling shops, a stark contrast to your own reality, but perhaps also a source of distant aspiration. The fight against disease in the slums was not just a medical battle, it was a social and economic one. It was a fight against poverty, against ignorance, against the indifference of those in power. It was a fight that would take decades, even centuries, to truly win. The legacy of these struggles still shapes our modern public health systems, a reminder of the vital importance of clean water, sanitation, and accessible health care for all. The shared experience of hardship also fostered a unique kind of dark humor. People would joke about their misfortunes, about the absurdity of their situation, finding levity in the face of overwhelming odds. This gallows humor was a coping mechanism, a way to diffuse tension and to find solidarity in shared suffering. It was a way of saying, yes, this is terrible, but at least we're in it together. Think about the simple act of breathing, something you do without a second thought. In the Victorian slum, every breath was a gamble. The air was thick with coal dust, factory fumes, and the effluvia of human and animal waste. Respiratory illnesses were rampant, from chronic bronchitis to deadly pneumonia. The damp, cold conditions only exacerbated these problems, making every winter a fight for survival. You'd wake up with a tightness in your chest, a persistent cough that rattled your bones, and the knowledge that relief was a distant dream. It's enough to make you appreciate every clean, crisp breath you take today. The warmth of human connection, whether in a crowded pub or a quiet conversation in a doorway, was perhaps the most profound source of joy. To know you weren't alone, to have someone to share your burdens with, to feel a sense of belonging. These were the true treasures of the slum. They were the threads that wove through the fabric of hardship, holding it together, preventing it from unraveling completely. One particularly grim aspect was the high incidence of rickets among children. This bone-deforming disease was caused by a severe vitamin D deficiency, a direct result of poor nutrition and lack of sunlight in the perpetually shadowed alleyways and overcrowded rooms. You'd see children with bowed legs and deformed limbs, their bodies permanently scarred by the conditions of their upbringing. It's a visible, heartbreaking reminder of the systemic failures that plagued these communities. These fleeting joys, however small, were the lifeblood of the Victorian slum. They were the moments that allowed people to endure, to hope, and to continue fighting for a better future. They remind us that even in the bleakest of circumstances, the human spirit finds ways to sing, to dance, and to connect, proving that joy, however fragile, can never be entirely extinguished. And then there was the mental health toll. The constant stress, the fear of illness, the grief, the lack of privacy, the sheer hopelessness, it all contributed to widespread mental anguish. While the Victorians didn't have our modern understanding of mental health, the signs of depression, anxiety, and trauma would have been pervasive. How could one maintain a healthy mind in such an unhealthy environment? It's a question that historians continue to grapple with, as the psychological impact of extreme poverty is often harder to quantify than the physical. You have seen the harshness, the hunger, and the fleeting moments of joy in the Victorian slums. But even in the deepest darkness, there were whispers of hope, fledgling attempts to alleviate suffering and bring about change. Today, we will explore the early attempts at reform, the first glimmers of compassion and intervention in a world that seemed to have been forgotten. The sheer resilience of the human spirit, however, is truly remarkable. Even amidst this constant battle with sickness and despair, people found ways to endure. They supported each other, shared what little they had, and clung to hope, however faint. They developed a grim humor, a way of laughing in the face of adversity, if only to keep from crying. It's a powerful testament to the indomitable nature of humanity, even when pushed to the absolute brink. Imagine you are standing in the middle of a familiar slum, but this time you notice something different. A woman dressed neatly, but not too ostentatiously, is talking to a group of women and children. She is not a hawker, nor is she a beggar. She is a visiting lady and one of the first volunteers from charitable organizations, bringing hygiene advice, moral pamphlets, and sometimes a little food or clothing. Her presence is a stark contrast to her surroundings, a reminder that not everyone is indifferent to your fate. You felt the relentless grind of labor and the pervasive weight of scarcity? Now, let's focus on the most primal and persistent of all struggles in the Victorian slum: the gnawing hunger and the deceptive nature of the food that was available. In this world, eating wasn't a pleasure, it was a desperate act of survival, fraught with peril and often leading to further illness. A common historical fact is the rise of charities and social reformers in the Victorian era. As the divide between wealth and poverty became more pronounced, some in the middle and upper classes became aware of the terrible living conditions of the poor and felt a responsibility to act. This was not a homogeneous movement. It included many different groups with different motives and methods, from missionaries to statists, all trying to solve the problem of poverty in their own way. Imagine your stomach, a constant drum of emptiness, a dull ache that never truly goes away. This isn't the temporary hunger you feel before a meal. This is a deep, systemic emptiness, a constant companion that dictates every decision. You wake with it, you work with it, and often, you go to sleep with it. The common historical fact is that malnutrition was rampant, leading to weakened immune systems, stunted growth, and a pervasive lack of energy that made the already arduous daily tasks even more difficult. Your body is constantly running on fumes, a machine desperately trying to keep going with insufficient fuel. You may see small, old signs pointing the way to a ragged school. These were free schools for the poorest children, often run by volunteers and funded by charitable donations. Inside, you will see children, many of them very young, sitting on simple benches, trying to learn to read, write, and do maths. The air may still be damp and cold, but there is a focus, a thirst for learning in their eyes. This is a rare opportunity to escape the vicious cycle of ignorance and child labor. The diet of the poor was incredibly monotonous and lacking in essential nutrients. The staples were bread, potatoes, and weak, often adulterated. Tea. Meat was a rare luxury, perhaps a small joint on a Sunday if the week's earnings allowed. Or more likely, a cheap cut of offal or scraps from the butcher. Fresh fruits and vegetables were expensive and perishable, making them largely inaccessible. You'd eat to fill your stomach, not for taste or nutrition. Every meal was a utilitarian act, a desperate attempt to quiet the incessant rumbling within. A little-known detail about ragtag schools is that they often provide not only basic education, but also hot meals and second-hand clothes. For many children, the school meal may be the only decent meal of the day, and clothes may be the only thing keeping them warm. These schools are not just places of learning, but also places of refuge, a temporary safe haven from the harshness of the streets. Imagine getting a hot meal just for showing up to class. It's like the ultimate attendance incentive, isn't it? One of the most insidious aspects of food in the Victorian slum was widespread adulteration. Unscrupulous vendors, eager to maximize profits, would add all sorts of horrifying substances to their products. This is a common historical fact. Milk was often watered down and thickened with chalk or plaster of Paris. Bread could contain alum, sawdust, or even plaster. Tea leaves were sometimes reused or mixed with iron filings, and sweets might be colored with toxic dyes containing lead or arsenic. You might be eating something that looked like food, but was slowly poisoning you, or at the very least, offering no nutritional value. It's like buying a health shake, only to find out it's just flavored water and glitter. Alongside the philanthropic organizations, there were also powerful voices that began to call for public sanitation reform. Reformers like Edwin Chadwick, whom we mentioned earlier, collected data and argued that poor sanitation not only caused disease but also undermined worker productivity and was costly to society. They proposed better sewer systems, cleaner water supplies, and a more efficient garbage collection. It was an uphill battle against government indifference, landlord interests, and public ignorance. You could hear heated debates in pubs or on street corners. Historians still debate whether the early public sanitation reforms were motivated primarily by a desire to improve public health, or by a fear that disease from the slums would spread to the wealthier parts of the city. Was it compassion or self-preservation? Probably both, a complex mix of motives. Imagine the sheer audacity of these practices. You, desperate for sustenance, spend your hard-earned pennies on what you believe is food, only to be cheated and potentially harmed. There were no food safety regulations as we know them today. No government oversight to protect the consumer. The poor were particularly vulnerable, as they had no recourse, no means to complain, and no alternative options. It was a brutal form of exploitation, preying on the most vulnerable. The creation of the Metropolitan Police, or Bobbies, was also an attempt to bring more order and safety to these areas. Initially, they were often viewed with suspicion and distrust, but gradually their presence began to bring a measure of stability. You might see a police officer on patrol, his dark blue uniform a rare touch of authority in a chaotic world. He may be a scary person, but sometimes he may also be the only person you can turn to for help. An obscure detail about food adulteration is the use of red lead to enhance the color of certain cheeses and confectionery. This highly toxic substance could cause severe lead poisoning, leading to neurological damage and even death. Imagine a child, delighted by a brightly colored sweet, unknowingly consuming a deadly poison. It's a chilling thought, a hidden danger lurking in seemingly innocuous treats. It makes you wonder how many mysterious illnesses were just slow poisoning. Early labor movements and unions also began to form in the slums and factories. Workers, tired of exploitation and poor working conditions, began to unite to demand better wages, shorter hours, and safer conditions. This was a dangerous struggle and too often in the face of repression from employers and police. But it was a sign that the poor were no longer passively accepting their fate. They were beginning to demand their rights. The search for food was a daily odyssey. You might spend hours scouring the streets, hoping to find discarded scraps, or waiting outside bakeries for stale bread. Street vendors were a common sight, selling cheap, often questionable fare. Hot pies, eels, tripe, and fried fish were popular, but their hygiene was often dubious, cooked in rancid fat and exposed to the elements. Eating from these stalls was a gamble, a trade-off between hunger and the risk of immediate illness. You'd probably develop a sixth sense for which vendor looked least likely to give you cholera. You could see secret meetings in the back rooms of pubs, where men and women whispered about strategies, about strikes, and about a better future. There was a tension in the air, a mixture of hope and fear. Remember those strikes and riots we talked about earlier? That's where they started, in hushed conversations and bold plans. For those with a few pennies, the public house, or pub, offered a temporary escape and often a cheap meal. A pint of beer or gin, often watered down, could dull the pangs of hunger and the harsh realities of life. Some pubs offered penny dinners or soup kitchens, providing a meager bowl of watery soup or stew. While these offered some relief, they were rarely nutritious enough to sustain a family. The rise of charity hospitals and clinics was also part of this wave of reform. Although often viewed with suspicion at first, as medical knowledge advanced and sanitation improved, hospitals began to become places where the poor could seek medical care. Doctors and nurses, often working in difficult conditions, devoted themselves to alleviating suffering. You might see a long line of people waiting outside a small clinic, hoping to be seen and given medicine. Historians still debate whether the widespread consumption of alcohol among the working class was primarily a coping mechanism for the harsh realities of slum life, or if it was a significant contributor to their poverty and social problems. Was it a symptom or a cause? The truth, as often is the case, is likely a complex interplay of both. A vicious cycle where despair led to drinking, and drinking deepened despair. Less well known is the role of self-styled socialists, people like Charles Booth, who conducted detailed surveys of the lives of the poor in London. They drew maps of poverty-stricken areas, recording the income, occupation, and living conditions of each family. Their work, though sometimes investigative in nature, provided important data with which reformers could argue for policy changes. Imagine someone going door to door, meticulously documenting every aspect of your miserable life. It's a bit intrusive, but at least someone was paying attention. Right reformers also began to focus on housing. They argued that improved living conditions were essential to improving the health and morals of the poor. Initial social housing projects began to appear, albeit on a very small scale compared to the need. These new buildings, while still basic, provided clean water, better drainage systems, and less crowded living spaces. It was a small but important step toward a better future. The sheer lack of variety in the diet meant that people suffered from chronic nutritional deficiencies. Scurvy, caused by a lack of vitamin C, was common, leading to bleeding gums, bruising, and extreme fatigue. Rickets, as we discussed, deformed children's bones due to lack of vitamin D. Anemia from lack of iron left people pale and perpetually exhausted. Your body was constantly fighting a battle it couldn't win, slowly breaking down from the inside out. The establishment of organizations such as the Salvation Army was also part of the reform movement. They provided not only spiritual support, but also meals, shelter, and help finding work. They reached out to the most abandoned in society, those often overlooked by other organizations. Their presence brought a glimmer of hope to those who had lost everything. You could hear their brass trumpets echoing through the alley, a rare cheerful sound in the slums. Imagine the constant cravings, the desperate longing for something fresh, something sweet, something simply different. Your palate would be accustomed to blandness, to the same few flavors day after day, a single apple, a piece of fresh cheese. Even a simple egg would be a rare and treasured treat. It's enough to make you appreciate the sheer abundance and variety of food available to you today. Historians still debate whether these reform efforts were real solutions to the problem of poverty, or just temporary measures that soothed the symptoms without addressing the root causes. Were they genuine acts of kindness, or were they attempts to maintain social order? The answer probably lies somewhere in between, a combination of compassion and self-preservation. The preparation of food was also incredibly basic, with no running water, no refrigeration, and often only a single fireplace for cooking. Meals were simple and quick. A pot of gruel, a boiled potato, or a piece of fried fish would be the extent of culinary endeavors. There was no concept of elaborate cooking, no time for leisurely meals. Eating was a necessity, a quick refuel before returning to the endless toil. Change came slowly, often in small increments, and faced considerable resistance. Landlords opposed new regulations. Industrialists fought labor laws, and the wealthy were often indifferent to the plight of the poor. But the voices for reform grew louder, backed by mounting evidence of the terrible living conditions and their consequences. The psychological impact of constant hunger and the anxiety surrounding food cannot be overstated. It was a pervasive, nagging worry that colored every thought. Parents would go without food themselves to ensure their children had something to eat, a heartbreaking act of self-sacrifice. The fear of starvation was a very real and immediate threat, not an abstract concept. You'd learn to ignore the hunger pangs, to push them down, but they were always there, a constant reminder of your precarious existence. You could sense a subtle change in the air, a shift from utter despair to a glimmer of hope. People began to talk about improvement, about progress, about a future where their children could have a better life. It was not a sudden revolution, but a gradual change in perceptions and attitudes. Even the water, essential for life, was often a source of illness. Drawn from communal pumps, it was frequently contaminated by sewage, leading to outbreaks of cholera and other waterborne diseases. You were faced with a terrible choice: drink the contaminated water and risk illness, or go without and suffer from dehydration. It was a no-win situation, a cruel irony where the very thing meant to sustain you could kill you. The introduction of public health laws, although initially weak, laid the foundations for modern public health systems. Housing laws, although often ignored, began to challenge the absolute power of landlords. Child labor laws, although inconsistently enforced, gradually helped reduce child exploitation. The reliance on cheap, processed foods meant that the poor were often consuming a diet high in carbohydrates and low in protein, vitamins, and minerals. This created a cycle of poor health, where weakened bodies were more susceptible to illness, and illness prevented them from working, thus perpetuating their poverty. It was a trap, a vicious circle from which it was incredibly difficult to escape. A little-known detail is the emergence of settlement houses in the slums. These are places where college students and middle-class people move to live and work alongside the poor, providing education, social activities, and community support. They believe that living among the people they want to help will allow them to better understand the problems and find more effective solutions. Imagine a bunch of well-meaning hipsters moving into your slum, trying to understand the struggle. It's a bit quaint, but their hearts were in the right place, mostly. The desperation for food sometimes led to desperate measures. Petty theft, scavenging, and even begging were common. You might see children with outstretched hands, their eyes pleading for a morsel of food. It was a world where hunger could drive people to acts they would never consider in more comfortable circumstances. The moral lines blurred when survival was at stake. These reform efforts are not perfect, and they often fail. But they represent an important shift in how society views poverty. Instead of blaming individuals, more and more people are beginning to realize that systemic problems require systemic solutions. The penny dreadfuls, cheap sensationalist novels popular at the time, often featured dramatic tales of poverty and hunger, sometimes romanticizing the desperate lives of the urban poor. While fictional, they reflected a societal awareness of the widespread hunger, even if they didn't always portray its grim reality accurately. It's a funny thought, isn't it? That people would read about starvation while trying not to starve themselves? You can see signs of this change in the smallest things: a new public water tap installed, an alley cleaned up, a child walking to school with a book in hand. These are not big changes, but they are signs that a better future may be within reach. The struggle to improve life in the Victorian slums was a long and difficult one that still resonates today. But those whispers of reform, those early attempts at change, sowed the seeds of a more just and humane world. They remind us that even in the deepest darkness, hope can still grow, and change, however slow, can come. You've journeyed through the suffocating streets, the cramped homes, the relentless toil, the gnawing hunger, the shadows of crime, the lost childhoods, and the nascent whispers of reform in the Victorian slum. Now, as our journey through the past draws to a close, let's step back into the present and reflect on the lasting legacy of those forgotten lives, the echoes that still resonate in our modern cities. The fight against food adulteration and for better nutrition was a long and arduous one. It took decades of campaigning by reformers, scientists, and public health advocates to bring about meaningful change. The establishment of food safety laws and regulations was a slow process, met with resistance from powerful commercial interests. The legacy of this struggle is the food safety standards we enjoy today. A reminder of a time when every meal was a potential gamble. Imagine yourself back on a bustling street in a contemporary metropolis. The air is cleaner, the buildings taller, the light brighter. You see people rushing by, absorbed in their smartphones, sipping coffee from disposable cups. The sounds are different too: the hum of electric cars, the distant siren, the chatter of 1,000 different languages. It's a world vastly different from the one we just explored. A world that seems to have left the grime and despair of the Victorian slum far behind. Think about the simple pleasure of a full stomach, the feeling of satiety after a good meal. In the Victorian slum, that feeling was a rare and precious gift. Most of the time, you existed in a state of perpetual hunger, your body craving nutrients it rarely received. It was a constant, low-level torture, a background hum of discomfort that never truly ceased. Yet, if you listen closely, if you look beyond the gleaming facades, you can still hear the faint echoes. The common historical fact is that many of the public health systems, housing regulations, and labor laws we take for granted today were born directly out of the appalling conditions of the Victorian slums. The struggles of those forgotten lives laid the groundwork for the social safety nets that protect us, however imperfectly, from the worst excesses of poverty. The very idea of clean water flowing freely from your tap, of a toilet in your home, of safe working conditions. These were hard-won victories, forged in the crucible of Victorian hardship. The children, especially, bore the brunt of this food scarcity. Their growing bodies desperately needed nourishment, but often received the least. This led to widespread developmental problems, stunting their physical and cognitive growth. You'd see children who were small for their age, their faces pale and their eyes lacking the sparkle of youth. It was a tragedy unfolding on a massive scale, a generation robbed of their potential by the simple lack of food. Think about the concept of public health. The understanding that disease spreads through contaminated water and poor sanitation, not just bad air, led to massive infrastructure projects like London's sewer system, a monumental undertaking that transformed the city. This was a direct response to the cholera epidemics that ravaged the slums. So, every time you flush a toilet or drink a glass of tap water, you are, in a way, benefiting from the suffering and the subsequent reforms spurred by the Victorian poor. It's like they were the unwitting beta testers for modern urban living. And boy, did they give some harsh feedback. The psychological impact of chronic hunger also extended to social behavior. It could lead to irritability, apathy, and a diminished capacity for joy. When your entire being is focused on the primal need for food, there is little room for anything else. Relationships could become strained, and the struggle for survival could sometimes turn neighbor against neighbor. It was a constant test of human endurance, pushing people to their absolute limits. The fight for workers' rights also has its roots firmly planted in the Victorian era. The long hours, dangerous conditions, and pitiful wages endured by factory workers and those in sweated trades led to the formation of early trade unions and the demand for legislation. The Factory Acts, which gradually limited working hours, improved safety, and restricted child labor, were direct results of these struggles. So, your 8-hour workday, your lunch break, your right to a safe workplace, these are legacies of the Victorian laborer's relentless fight for dignity. And yet, even in the face of such profound hunger and deceit, people found ways to share, to offer a crust of bread to a starving neighbor, to pool their meager resources for a communal meal. These acts of kindness, however small, were powerful affirmations of humanity in a world that often seemed intent on stripping it away. They were tiny sparks of light in the overwhelming darkness, proving that even when your stomach was empty, your heart didn't have to be. An obscure detail about the lasting impact of the slums is how they influenced urban planning. The chaotic, unplanned growth of the Victorian slums, with their narrow, winding streets and overcrowded tenements, led to a conscious effort in later decades to design cities with wider thoroughfares, more green spaces, and better ventilated housing. The very layout of many modern urban areas, with their parks and boulevards, can be seen as a direct reaction to the unlivable conditions of the past. It's almost like they decided, you know what, let's not build death traps anymore. You've grappled with hunger and the deceptive nature of food. Now, let's step into the deeper shadows of the Victorian slum, where the harsh realities of poverty often blurred the lines between desperation and depravity. This is a world where crime wasn't always a choice, but often a grim necessity, and where despair hung heavy in the air, a constant companion. Even the way we perceive poverty and social responsibility has been shaped by the Victorian experience. The initial tendency to blame the poor for their own plight gradually gave way to a recognition of systemic issues. The understanding that poverty is often a result of economic forces, lack of opportunity, and societal structures, not just individual moral failings. This shift in perspective, though incomplete, laid the foundation for modern welfare states and social justice movements. Imagine the streets at night. The gaslights, already dim and infrequent in these poor districts, cast long, dancing shadows that seem to twist and distort familiar shapes. The fog, ever present, wraps around you like a cold, damp shroud, muffling sounds and reducing visibility to mere feet. This isn't the romanticized fog of a Sherlock Holmes mystery. This is a thick, sooty blanket that conceals danger and amplifies fear. You hear the distant, muffled cries, the sudden scuffle of feet, the sharp bark of a dog, sounds that make your heart quicken and your senses sharpen. You're no longer just observing, you're navigating a landscape where every shadow could hide a threat. Historians still debate whether the Victorian era's social reforms were primarily driven by altruism and a genuine desire to alleviate suffering, or by a more pragmatic fear of social unrest and the spread of disease to the wealthier classes. Was it a triumph of compassion, or a necessary evil to maintain stability? The answer, as is often the case with complex historical phenomena, is likely a nuanced blend of both. The common historical fact is that crime rates in Victorian London, particularly in the overcrowded slums, were exceptionally high. Poverty, desperation, and a lack of legitimate opportunities pushed many to illegal activities. For some, it was a means of survival. For others, a path to a fleeting sense of power or rebellion in a world that offered them little. The sheer density of people, combined with the anonymity of the sprawling city, created fertile ground for all manner of illicit activities. The concept of universal education, too, owes much to the Victorian era. The ragged schools and other philanthropic efforts highlighted the desperate need for education among the poor, leading to the gradual implementation of compulsory schooling. The idea that every child, regardless of their background, deserves an education is a direct legacy of those who fought to bring literacy and knowledge to the slum children. So, that math class you hated. You can thank a Victorian reformer for that. Petty theft was rampant. A loaf of bread snatched from a baker's cart, a coat pilfered from a washing line, a purse deftly lifted from a distracted passerby. These were common occurrences. For a starving family, a successful theft could mean the difference between eating and going hungry. The stakes were incredibly high, and the risks even higher. If caught, the consequences could be severe. A brutal beating from an angry mob, a lengthy prison sentence, or even transportation to a penal colony on the other side of the world. Imagine the constant internal debate: risk starvation, or risk everything for a chance at a meal. It's a choice no one should ever have to make. The very architecture of our cities still carries the scars of this past. While the worst of the slums have been demolished, the patterns of development, the division between wealthy and poorer districts, and the challenges of urban density continue to echo the Victorian experience. Gentrification, housing crises, and debates over affordable living are modern manifestations of the same underlying tensions that plagued Victorian London. But crime wasn't just about survival. Organized gangs, often operating out of the labyrinthine alleyways and hidden courtyards, controlled various illicit trades. They ran protection rackets, gambling dens, and prostitution rings. These gangs, often led by charismatic but ruthless figures, offered a perverse kind of order in a chaotic world, but at a terrible price. You might be forced to pay tribute for protection, or risk violent retribution. It was a parallel system of governance, one based on fear and brute force, where the law of the land often held little sway. Think about the resilience of the human spirit. The people of the Victorian slums endured unimaginable hardship, yet they found ways to survive, to connect, to create, and to hope. Their struggles remind us of the incredible capacity of humanity to adapt, to persevere, and to find dignity even in the most dehumanizing circumstances. Their stories are a testament to the fact that even when everything is taken away, the core of what makes us human, our capacity for love, for laughter, for resistance, remains. Prostitution was a grim reality for countless women and girls, often driven to it by extreme poverty. With few other avenues for earning a living wage and facing the constant threat of starvation or the workhouse, selling one's body became a desperate last resort. The streets teemed with women of all ages, their faces painted, their clothes often ragged but attempting a semblance of allure. They were vulnerable to violence, disease, and exploitation. Their lives a constant struggle for survival in a society that condemned them while simultaneously creating the conditions that forced them into such a life. It's a heartbreaking testament to the lack of options, isn't it? When your only choice is between one kind of degradation and another, the penny dreadfuls of the Victorian era, those sensationalist stories of crime and urban life, have evolved into our modern true crime podcasts, gritty dramas, and social commentaries. The fascination with the underbelly of society, the desire to understand the lives of those on the margins, is a thread that connects us directly to the Victorian fascination with their own urban poor. We still tell stories about the dark corners of our world, seeking to understand and perhaps to learn. An obscure detail about crime in the slums is the prevalence of fences, individuals who specialized in buying stolen goods. These fences were crucial to the criminal underworld, providing a market for stolen items and enabling thieves to convert their illicit gains into cash. They often operated out of seemingly legitimate shops or pubs, their true business conducted in hushed whispers and shadowed back rooms. Imagine walking past a seemingly ordinary shop, unaware of the dark transactions happening within. It's a hidden economy, thriving in the underbelly of the city. The philanthropic spirit that emerged in the Victorian era, with its emphasis on charity and social work, continues today in countless NGOs, charities, and volunteer organizations. While the methods and understanding have evolved, the fundamental impulse to help those in need, to alleviate suffering, and to advocate for the vulnerable remains a powerful force. It's like a really long relay race of good intentions. Violence was an ever-present threat. Brawls in pubs, street fights over territory or perceived slights, domestic disputes escalating into brutality. These were common occurrences. The police force, still relatively new and often overwhelmed, struggled to maintain order in these densely populated and volatile districts. You might witness a violent altercation, a sudden explosion of rage, and instinctively shrink back into the shadows, hoping not to become involved. The rule of law often felt distant, replaced by the brutal realities of the street. The challenges of public health, though vastly different in scope, still resonate. From global pandemics to the fight against chronic diseases, the lessons learned from the Victorian battles against cholera and tuberculosis continue to inform our approaches to health and wellness. The understanding that health is a collective responsibility, not just an individual one, is a direct inheritance from that era. Historians still debate whether the Victorian authorities' approach to crime, which often focused on punishment and deterrence rather than addressing the root causes of poverty, was ultimately effective. Did harsh sentences truly reduce crime, or did they simply push it further underground, making it more organized and desperate? It's a complex question, highlighting the ongoing tension between law enforcement and social reform. The legacy of the Victorian slum is not just one of suffering and despair. It is also a legacy of resilience, of reform, and of the enduring human capacity to strive for a better world. The shadows of those forgotten lives still stretch into our present, reminding us of where we came from and how far we still have to go. They whisper lessons about inequality, about the importance of empathy, and about the continuous struggle for justice and dignity for all. The despair in the slums was palpable, a heavy cloak that settled over everything. It wasn't just the physical hardships, it was the crushing weight of knowing that escape was almost impossible. Generations were born, lived, and died within the same few streets, trapped in a cycle of poverty that seemed unbreakable. The lack of education, the absence of opportunity, the constant struggle for survival, all contributed to a pervasive sense of hopelessness. You'd see it in people's eyes, a dull, resigned look that spoke volumes about their shattered dreams. Even the way we consume news and information has an echo. The Victorian era saw the rise of cheap newspapers and mass media, bringing stories of the slums often sensationalized to a wider audience. This sparked public debate and eventually seats reform. Today, our constant flow of information, for better or worse, continues to highlight social issues, prompting discussion and hopefully endless action. Gambling dens, often hidden in basements or back rooms, offered a fleeting escape from this despair. For a few pennies, you could try your luck at cards or dice, hoping for a win that could change your fortunes, however temporarily. But the odds were always stacked against you, and more often than not, you'd lose your meager earnings, deepening your despair. It was a cruel illusion of hope, a momentary flicker that quickly died, leaving you poorer and more despondent than before. It's like buying a lottery ticket when you can barely afford bread, a desperate, irrational hope. The concept of community, so vital in the slums, continues to be a powerful force in modern urban life. While not born of the same desperate necessity, neighborhood groups, cultural associations, and online communities all seek to recreate that sense of belonging and mutual support that was so crucial for survival in the Victorian era. We still crave connection. Even in our hyper-individualized world, alcohol, particularly gin, was another common escape. Cheap and readily available, it offered a temporary oblivion, a way to numb the pain and forget the harsh realities of life. Pubs were crowded, noisy havens where people could drown their sorrows, share a laugh, or simply disappear into a haze of intoxication. But the escape was fleeting. and the consequences often dire addiction, further poverty, and increased violence. You'd see the glazed eyes, the stumbling gait, the slow decline of those consumed by the bottle. The sheer scale of urbanization and industrialization that defined the Victorian era continues to shape our world. The challenges of managing massive populations, providing adequate housing, and ensuring sustainable development are ongoing. The lessons learned or sometimes relearned from the Victorian experience inform our approaches to urban planning, environmental protection, and social policy today. The workhouse, as remember, was the ultimate symbol of despair. To be sent to the workhouse meant losing your freedom, your family as they were often separated by gender and age, and your dignity. Life inside was deliberately harsh, designed to deter anyone from seeking public assistance. It was a place of last resort, a living nightmare that haunted the dreams of every slum dweller. The fear of the workhouse was a powerful motivator, driving people to accept any work, no matter how degrading, to avoid its gates. The social conscience that began to stir in the Victorian era, prompting questions about fairness and justice, has never truly gone away. It continues to drive activism, political movements, and individual efforts to address inequality and create a more equitable society. The echoes of those who fought against the injustices of the slums still inspire those who fight for social justice today. The lack of education also contributed to the cycle of despair. With few schools available and children often forced into labor from a young age, literacy rates were low. This limited opportunities even further, trapping people in low-wage, unskilled jobs. The ability to read and write, to understand the world beyond your immediate surroundings, was a luxury. Imagine being unable to read a newspaper, a letter, or even a simple sign. Your world would be incredibly small, circumscribed by your immediate experiences. So, as you drift off to sleep tonight, remember the echoes, remember the struggles, the resilience, and the quiet triumphs of those who lived in the Victorian slums. Their lives, though often forgotten, laid the foundation for much of the comfort and security we enjoy today. And perhaps, just perhaps, their stories can inspire us to look closer at the hidden corners of our own modern cities, to recognize the echoes of hardship, and to continue the ongoing work of building a more just and compassionate world. The struggle to improve life in the Victorian slums was a long and difficult one that still resonates today. But those whispers of reform, those early attempts at change, planted the seeds of a more just and humane world. They remind us that even in the deepest darkness, hope can grow, and change, however slow, can come. Even the concept of justice was often skewed. The poor were more likely to be arrested, more likely to be convicted, and more likely to receive harsher sentences than their wealthier counterparts. The legal system, while theoretically impartial, often reflected the class biases of the era. A wealthy man might escape with a fine for a crime that would send a poor man to prison for years. It was a system that often felt rigged, further fueling the sense of injustice and despair. Now, as our story closes, let the images of damp streets, cramped rooms, and weary faces fade from your mind. Let the sounds of shouting, coughing, and factory whistles fade to a distant whisper. Remember that even in the harshest of circumstances, people find the strength to survive, to love, and to hope. Let their resilience be a gentle reminder that light can always find its way through the darkness, and that every small step toward kindness and understanding makes a difference. Take a deep breath. Feel the warmth of your bed, and know that you are safe and protected. One particularly grim aspect of the criminal underworld was the body snatchers, or resurrectionists. Though largely a phenomenon of the earlier part of the Victorian era, their legacy of fear lingered. These individuals exhumed recently buried corpses to sell to medical schools for anatomical study. The demand for cadavers outstripped legal supply, leading to this macabre trade. While not directly a crime of the slums, the fear of one's deceased loved ones being dug up was a terrifying thought for the poor, who often couldn't afford elaborate burials or secure graves. It's a truly ghoulish detail, isn't it? Even in death, there was no peace. The police, or bobbies, as they were affectionately, or sometimes not so affectionately known, were a relatively new presence in the Victorian era. Their effectiveness in the slums was often limited by their small numbers, the vastness of the areas they had to cover, and the deep-seated distrust of authority among the poor. They were often seen as agents of an oppressive system, rather than protectors. Confrontations between the police and slum dwellers were not uncommon, sometimes escalating into riots. The very architecture of the slums seemed to facilitate crime. The narrow, winding alleyways, the dark courtyards, the interconnected tenements. These created a perfect environment for criminals to operate unseen and to escape quickly. It was a maze, a labyrinth where the uninitiated could easily get lost, and where those who knew its secrets held a distinct advantage. You'd learn to navigate these hidden passages, to know which turns led to safety and which to danger. Beyond the physical discomfort, there was the constant psychological toll, the lack of privacy, the incessant noise, the inability to escape the smells and sights of poverty. It was a relentless assault on the senses and the spirit. Imagine never having a moment of true solitude, never being able to close a door and simply be alone with your thoughts. Every argument, every illness, every intimate moment was, by necessity, a public affair within the confines of the room. It's enough to drive a modern person absolutely bonkers. You'd probably start talking to yourself, just for the sheer novelty of having a private conversation. Despite the pervasive despair, there were glimmers of resistance and resilience. People found ways to survive, to support each other, and sometimes to fight back. Early forms of mutual aid societies, self-help groups, and even nascent political movements emerged from these communities, driven by a desire for change and a refusal to succumb entirely to the darkness. These were small, often fragile efforts, but they represented a defiant spark of hope in the face of overwhelming odds.